Right. Well, this Wednesday, this very night, is our last Wednesday service of the year. So don't forget that. If you come next Wednesday and everything's dark and cold and turned off, I told you why. It's the last one of the year. Next week already is Thanksgiving, isn't it? That's next week, isn't it? So next Wednesday, we won't be having a Wednesday night service because we have Thanksgiving. And then we're going to have Wednesday evening services on hiatus through the Christmas season. And then we'll be beginning our year with our couple of weeks of fasting and prayer. So those 2 weeks, don't forget the first 2 weeks of the year, we'll be meeting here every weeknight for an hour. I think it's in the bulletin, but I can't remember. Is it 5:30 to 6:30? Is that what we have on there? Yeah, 5:30 to 6:30 on those weeks. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we'll be meeting 5:30 to 6:30 for those first 2 weeks of the year for a time of worship and prayer as we do open our first couple of weeks of the year that way. And then Wednesday evening services will resume, and we'll pick back up in the book of Romans after that. So, next week is our service? No? Thank you, Nick. You got the right answer. Yeah, no, there's no service next week. So, with that, though, we are going to continue through the book of Romans this evening. So, you can turn there in your Bibles. We'll be looking at Romans chapter 11 tonight. And we are closing out the section where Paul has been talking about Israel, the things going on pertaining to Israel. And summarizing what we've seen in the book of Romans so far, we've seen that sin, if you've been listening, sin is a very ugly thing in all its forms. From the ones living in outright rebellion and rejection of God, to the self-righteous, finger-wagging moralists who believe that they've earned their way to favor with God, and everyone else in between all those people. That sin is an ugly thing. And Paul, by describing sin and the effects of sin in our lives, then is able to point to the truth that he says in Romans 3:10, that there is none righteous. No, not one. That there is not a single person that could claim righteousness on their own before God. And on top of that, he goes on later in that chapter, in Romans 3:23, to tell us that all have sinned. All have fallen short of the glory of God. And then in Romans 6:23, he says what we can earn, that the only thing we can earn on our own, the only wages that we can earn in our own right is sin and death. It says the wages of sin is death. That's all we earn in our flesh, death. We are without hope left to ourselves. We are full of sin, and we have no way to pay the debt that comes with that, to pay the price of redemption, to be free from the bonds of sin that bind us and lead us to death eternally, that leaves us in separation from a relationship with God. And from there, though, Paul didn't leave us. He didn't leave us just wallowing in that. From there, Paul then begins to tell us how God himself has made the way for us to have a relationship with him. That Jesus came and died in our place, which is our propitiation, our substitutionary sacrifice. That Jesus paid the price we could not pay to set us free from sin. He paid the redemption price. He has redeemed us. He is our redemption. And not only that, we are set free from the slavery to sin, but when we receive the free gift of salvation from God, he's redeemed us so completely, he's bought us back from sin so completely, that he sees us as if we've never, ever, ever sinned before, because he has justified us so completely. And God sees us that way because he's imparted to us his Spirit, which dwells inside of us as Christians. And because of his righteousness in us, he has set us apart for a holy use. He has sanctified us. He is our sanctification. All of that through the abundant grace of God. Because he said, yes, in Romans 6:23, for the wages of sin is death. That's the only thing we could earn. But he went on and said, but the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. Through faith in all that Jesus has done for us, we receive mercy from God He extends his righteousness to us, salvation from all our sins. We are truly born again. All of this is simply through grace. There's no work we can do that will earn us more favor from God. There is no work we can do that will earn us more salvation, that will make us more forgiven, more redeemed, more justified. Jesus paid for it all, and all we need do is confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe in our heart that he's risen from the dead, and the promise is that we will be saved. Grace, God's riches at Christ's expense. And then we are also promised that absolutely nothing can ever, nor is there anything that will ever separate us from the love of God through Jesus Christ. From there, Paul shifted focus to show how God's grace applies to God's chosen people, Israel. And that's what we've been looking at the last 3 chapters, where Paul told us in chapter 9 of Israel's past problem. We're told how unfailing grace has worked out in a very failing Israel. That though many Jews believed in Jesus as Messiah, the vast majority did not. And even the Jewish Christians were confused and were stumbled mainly over these 2 issues. That Jesus is the one and only Savior, and that Gentiles have the same access to salvation as the Jews. And Paul reminded them, just because they may have be a physical descendant of Abraham, that lineage does not give you an automatic in with God. He reminded them that not all of Abraham's descendants were accepted. God rejected Ishmael and chose Isaac. God rejected Esau and instead chose Jacob. Ishmael and Esau were both descendants of Abraham. But none of that has to do with God being unfair. For true fairness would mean that God would have to reject everyone. For we are all born dead in our sins and trespasses. And so it's an absolute miracle that God would extend his mercy and grace and compassion to anyone. And that in truth, all can be saved from sin. And from there, Paul points to the sovereignty of God and compares him to the potter forming the clay. And he looks at the absurdity of the clay, questioning the potter's intent or skill or methods. God has the right and the ability to choose to make a vessel for honor or dishonor. He also has the right and the ability to reform a vessel into what he sees fit for it to become. And that just because God may have a plan in mind for all of us, it does not relieve us of responsibility to choose him. And from there, Paul went into chapter 10 and told us of Israel's present predicament and looked at God's equity in his dealings with Israel. The stumbling stone, the rock of offense to them, Jesus as Messiah. And instead, they were choosing to continue to pursue righteousness through the law. And Paul's heart was that all of Israel would be saved, and he knows that in their current state, they are just ignorant of all that God's done for them. And he shows that Jesus came and fulfilled the law in its entirety, and that the intent of the law was completed in him. And in pointing us to our own inability to keep God's edicts, that the law was a taskmaster that pointed to death, but in Christ coming and perfectly keeping every edict and requirement for righteousness, he alone was able to claim the redemption cost, the perfect sacrifice for sin, once and for all sin, for all time. And no work will ever be able to earn us righteousness. Jesus did it all. But the present predicament of Israel is that they are blind to all that Jesus did, and because of that, they continue to try to make their own way to God through the law. Knowing that they still need to hear, they still need to have the truth brought to them, they still need Jesus. Now, regardless of the Jews' hardness of heart, Paul still shows that there is now no distinction between Jew or Greek. It no longer matters whether we are a descendant of Abraham or a Gentile. That through Jesus we are all grafted into one family. He is the same Lord over all who call on his name. And that brings us to where we are tonight, completing this section before he shifts focus again as he goes into Romans chapter 12. But here in Romans chapter 11, we will see Israel's promise of future glory. So let's read through chapter 11 together. Chapter 11, verse 1. It says, I say then, has God cast away his people? Certainly not. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not cast away his people whom he foreknew. Or do you not know the scripture says of Elijah how he pleads with God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what does the divine response say to him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Even so then, at this present time, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. And if by grace, then it's no longer of works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. But if it's of works, it's no longer grace. Otherwise, work is no longer work. What then? Israel has not obtained what it seeks, but the elect have obtained it, and the rest were blinded. Just as it is written, God has given them a spirit of stupor, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear, to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a recompense to them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they do not see, and bow down their back always. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fail or fall? Certainly not. But through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Now, if their fall is riches for the world, and their failure riches to the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? For I speak to you, Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. If by any means I may provoke to jealousy those who are my flesh, and save some of them. For if by being cast away is the reconciling of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? For if the first fruit is holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. And some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. Do not boast against the branches. But if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well said. Because of unbelief they were broken off, and you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he may not spare you either. Therefore consider the goodness and severity of God on those who fall. Severity, but towards you, goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come out of Zion, and he will turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but concerning the election, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. For as you were once disobedient to God, yet have now obtained mercy through their disobedience, even so, these also have now been disobedient, that though the mercy shown to you, they may also obtain mercy. For God has committed them all to disobedience, that he might have mercy on all. Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has become his counselor, or who has first given to him, and it shall be repaid to him? For of him, and through him, and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. Amen. Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for being our Savior. Speak to us tonight, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. So Paul completes this section on the spiritual situation here, the spiritual situation of Israel, here in chapter 11. And he begins by bringing up a very pertinent question that would come to mind based on what he had been discussing in the prior chapters, in verse 11, or chapter 11, verse 1. He says, I say then, has God cast away his people? He gives an emphatic answer, certainly not. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. He gives a question, the answer, and the evidence. The question, is God done with Israel? Based on all we saw in the last two chapters, I think it's a logical question. They rejected Jesus as Messiah. They reject the gospel. They continue to strive to fulfill God's requirements in the law through works and continue to fall short. But does this mean that Israel's fate is sealed and that they've been replaced by the Gentiles? Or as some has even taught, they've been replaced by the church? Well, the answer Paul gives very clearly here. Certainly not. God is not done with Israel. Despite all they've done and despite their present state, Israel is not permanently cast away. And Paul explains this with the evidence. He says the evidence that God has not cast away his people, look at me. Paul said, look, I am a Jewish. I am also an Israelite. Paul's faith in Jesus as Messiah proved that there were some Jews chosen by God who embraced the gospel. And Paul points to himself and his conversion as an illustration of what will happen eventually to Israel. In verse 2, he says, God has not cast away his people whom he foreknew. Or do you not know the scripture says of Elijah how he pleads with God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed your prophets, torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what does the divine response say to him? I've reserved for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Even so then, at this present time, there's a remnant according to the election of grace. Now in Paul's day, Israel was as a group generally rejected Jesus as Messiah. Yet a substantial remnant embraced the gospel, and that remnant did accept Jesus as Lord. And God repeatedly worked in Israel through a faithful remnant, just as he did in the example Paul cites, the days of Elijah. Things were so bad in Elijah's time that he was actually praying against his own people. They killed the prophets. They've torn down the altars. I alone am left. He's basically saying, go get them, God. And what was God's response to Elijah's despair? He told Elijah, you know what? You need to get your eyes off yourself. And you need to look at what I'm doing. He said, I've reserved for myself a remnant. There are 7,000 that have never bowed their knee to the deplorable idol of Baal. And it's so easy to get our eyes off the Lord and onto ourselves. And at that point, it's easy to despair and feel isolated and alone. But God always has a plan, and he has a purpose. He showed Elijah, even the great prophet Elijah, that he was not the only one. I have 7,000 others. Told Elijah, you need to stop despairing. I've got this. He wasn't chiding him, but he was encouraging him. Just continue in what I've called you to do. Don't worry about everyone else. You do what I told you to do. Don't worry about the rest. Don't pray for me to destroy them. Pray for that those I have in reserve continue in me. And Paul goes on to say that the same was true about Israel then. There will always be a remnant in Israel. There always has been, there presently is, there always will be a believing minority in Israel. God does not need a large group to make a big impact or to do a great work. He often works through small groups or a group that starts off small. Though not many in Paul's day embraced Jesus as Messiah, a remnant did, and God will use that group in a big way. We have the evidence right here in the book we hold in our hands. Now in chapter 11, verse 6, he said, and if by grace, then it's no longer of works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. But if it is of works, it's no longer grace. Otherwise, work is no longer work. That remnant is not made up of those who meticulously keep the law and thus have earned extra favor from God. The remnant's made up of those who are saved by grace. And Paul reminds us again what grace is, the free gift of God. Not given with an eye to performance or potential in the one receiving the grace, but given only out of the mercy, the kindness, and the love of the giver. And as principles, grace and works do not go together for salvation. Either we're saved by grace and grace alone, or we're saved through works and works alone. we know it's through grace by which we're saved. And so that means we are not rewarded with blessing on our lives or family or anything else because of how hard we are working or how good we are being. It is only through and by God's grace that we are blessed. Now, that doesn't alleviate the responsibility to do works, because we're also told faith without works is dead. But the difference is we don't get salvation through a mixture of grace and works. We don't get extra saved. We don't get more saved. We don't find more favor. That's the difference. When it gets added on to grace, then it becomes legalism. And you start waning and dying off. But we are told that we are supposed to do works as evidence of our salvation. And that's the difference. Grace, though, is a free gift from Him and Him alone. In verse 7, it says, "What then? Israel has not obtained what it seeks, but the elect have obtained it, and the rest were blinded. Just as it is written, God has given them a spirit of stupor, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear, to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a recompense to them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they do not see, and bow down their back always." The elect among Israel received what God had for them and what Jesus did for them and responded to the mercy of God. But the rest, well, they were hardened by their own rejection. And Paul cites Isaiah 29 and Psalm 69 to point to what Israel's rebellion and rejection of what God was doing had led them to. It led them to the point where they were spiritually blinded. They have the scriptures, but they can't see the fulfillment in Jesus unless the blinders are lifted by God and the darkening of their eyes is healed. But God has a plan in only saving a remnant at the present time. In chapter 11, verse 11, it says, "I say then, if they stumbled, that they should fall." After pointing out the lost condition of the blinded majority, Paul asks if they have stumbled in such a way that their fall is permanent. Have they been shoved down never to stand up again? Have they been snared in their ritualism and caught up in their traditions and ceremonies in a way that will never allow for them to stand again with God as a nation? And he emphatically answered that. Certainly not! Exclamation point. Certainly not. But through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. So absolutely not. God is not done with Israel. He has a purpose for what is going on. Their fall opened the door for God to work among the Gentiles, which in turn makes the Jews jealous of the simplicity of our salvation. It wasn't that the Jewish rejection of Jesus as Messiah caused Gentiles to be saved. Gentiles could convert to Judaism, but it gave more opportunity for the gospel to go to the Gentiles. And many Gentiles responded to the gospel, and that God uses. He provoked Israel to be jealous of the blessing the Gentiles have through Jesus. Now, God's not written them off, quite the contrary. He's using it all as a means to woo and reach His people. In verse 12, it says, "Now if their fall is riches for the world and their failure riches to the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, if by any means I may provoke to jealousy those who are my flesh and save some of them." Paul's desire isn't only that these riches would be enjoyed by the Gentiles only, but that the Jews would be provoked to a good kind of jealousy, motivating them to receive some of the blessing the Gentiles currently enjoy. So if the world has been blessed by the stumbling of Israel, how much more will the world be blessed when they stand in belief and submission to Jesus Christ? In verse 15, it says, "For if by being cast away is the reconciling of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? For if the first fruit is holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and fatness of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches. But if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well said. Because of unbelief they were broken off, and you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he may not spare you either. So to the Gentiles, yes, Jewish rejection of Jesus made into a blessing for the world. But consider how great a blessing it will be when the Jews do accept Jesus. The first fruit spoken of here seemingly represents the first Christians who were Jewish. Think about that. The first Christians were Jewish. Their conversion was something holy and good for the church, after all. Each of the apostles, most of the human authors of Scripture were Jewish. If the conversion of this first fruit was good for the Gentiles, how much better will it be when the complete harvest is brought in? And with the picture of the tree and the branches, Paul reminds the Gentile Christians that it's only by God's grace that they can be grafted into the tree of God, the root of which is Israel. And Paul reminds them, the Gentiles should not see themselves as superior to Jews. He reminds us that the root supports the branches, not the other way around. And that Gentiles are grafted into the tree by faith alone, through grace, and not by works or merit. And if Gentiles are unbelieving, they'll be cut off just like the unbelieving Israel was. Verse 22 says, therefore, consider the goodness and severity of God on those who fell. Severity, but towards you, goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? Paul tells us to learn a lesson from the Jews. Gives us his word picture of the tree. Realizing that, although you were grafted in by God's grace, you can be cut off as well if you refuse to respond to God's grace. In John 15, 1 through 8, Jesus tells us that he is the vine and we are the branches, and that we need to abide in him. He said that any branch that does not abide in him, that it'll be cut off and cast into the fire and burned. Now, it's a strong warning, and one I don't wish to tempt. We really do need to understand both the goodness and the severity of God. And if Israel was cut off because of their unbelief, being a cultivated olive branch, how much easier will it be for them to be regrafted back on and bear much fruit? Paul's warning us, don't be full of pride, thinking that we are something more than we are, that God has chosen us and rejected them. That's the type of pride that helped lead the Jews to stumble to begin with. But God's plan for Israel absolutely includes their eventual restoration. And verse 25 says, for I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion. The blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come out of Zion, and he will turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Paul now summarizes what he said in chapter 11, verses 11 through 24. God's purpose in allowing blindness in part to come upon Israel is so the fullness of the Gentiles can come in. At some point, the last of the Gentiles will come to know Jesus. The fullness of the Gentiles will be reached. At some time, somewhere, someone will come to know Jesus, and God will say, that's it. And Jesus will return for his bride. And at that point, all of God's attention will turn to Israel. And during the tribulation, a great awakening, per se, will happen in Israel. The blinders will be removed, and the Jews will embrace Jesus as Messiah. Now in chapter 11, verse 28, it says, concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But concerning the election, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Why will God gather Israel? Because his calling is sure. He didn't change his mind about Israel. And he doesn't change his mind about you either. 2 Timothy 2:13 says that if we are faithless, He remains faithful. He cannot deny himself. Get that. Even when we are faithless, he remains faithful because he cannot deny his nature. I'm so glad for that. He is constant. And even in our ever ebbing and flowing, our waning and waxing of our walk with the Lord, he remains faithful. It isn't reliant upon how good you are that day. You know, I did really good today. I prayed 3 times. I even remembered to pray for my food. I was really good today. Boy, he's got to be really happy with me. He's going to bless me now. Just as much as when you completely screwed up and you went, I didn't think about God at all today. In fact, what I chose to do today, I just flat out chose to sin. God's faithfulness to you is constant. He sees you under his grace. And he's going to work with you, even in your ups and downs of your life and your walk with him, because he is faithful even when you are faithless. God did not bring you to him and extend his grace and mercy just to drop you. He will complete the work he began in you because he is faithful. In verse 30 it says, For as you were once disobedient to God, yet have now obtained mercy through their disobedience. Meaning the Gentile Christians came from disobedience, yet God showed us mercy, in part through the disobedience of Israel. In verse 31, he says, Even so, these also have now been disobedient, that through the mercy shown you, they also may obtain mercy. So if God used the disobedience of Israel for the good of the Gentiles, he can also use the mercy shown to Gentiles for the mercy of Israel. Verse 32 says, For God has committed them all to disobedience, that he might have mercy on all. The idea is that God has shut up both Jew and Gentile into custody as lawbreakers, and God offers mercy to all of us evenly and freely through the person and the work of Jesus. The Jew today knows that without the shedding of blood that there's no remission of sin, as it says in Leviticus 17:11. And there's no shedding of blood in Israel today, as there's no temple. And that causes a great deal of angst amongst the Jews. And our celebrating the one sacrifice of Jesus Christ and the mercy of God that sacrifice produced will perhaps provoke them to be a part of the remnant at this time. The goal of God is to woo Israel, not to reject them. In verse 33, it says, Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has become his counselor? Or who is first given to him, and it shall be repaid to him? For of him, and through him, and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. Amen. So as Paul considers the mystery of God's great plan of redemption, he breaks into spontaneous praise. There are things we will never ever begin to understand about all that God has done and is doing in his plan for redemption and relationship. There are aspects of all of it we will never begin to fully understand. Election versus free will. Sovereignty versus our responsibility. We could spend hours and hours reading and studying and writing and pondering and arguing. And some things we will never be able to reconcile in our humanness or in our human minds. Our brains can't fathom the depth of the riches of the grace of God. And it reaches a point where we need to forget trying to figure it all out and just marvel at the goodness God has shown to us. We can never outgive God. We can never tip the scales to where God becomes our debtor because of what we do. It's all him. The plan came from God, not man. He found us, redeemed us, justified us, sanctified us, all through his mercy and grace and compassion and love. And the fact that we can't figure out God should make us join Paul and glorify him all the more. It should give us more comfort that he is beyond our understanding, because that gives us a really big God. If we could understand him, for me, he wouldn't be big enough to be my God then. If I could put him in a box and define every little thing about what he did. then he wouldn't be omnipotent. He wouldn't be omniscient. He wouldn't be omnipresent. There has to, by those definitions alone, be aspects of God in the infinite which are beyond my understanding, which should spin my head. There should be, or I don't want him as my God. But that's who he is. So I find comfort in the fact that my God is unfathomable. I find comfort in the fact that I can't understand everything he's done or why. I find comfort in that. Because then I know I've got a really big God when I need a really big God. You know what I mean? Because there's things in life where I need a really big God. And knowing my God is big enough to do all of that gives me comfort in those times, in that way. And it should for you too. You know, there's a lot of things in life that are a gamble. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world and in ourselves, and none of us know what the future truly holds physically in our lives. But one thing in our lives that is absolutely certain is the spiritual. God's promises to us. God's promises that when we come to him, we find rest for our souls. We find peace in our hearts. And we find purpose in our lives. All of that is certain. None of it's a gamble. In Romans 8:28, Paul wrote that amazing promise that all things work together for good for those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. If I love God, if I surrender to him, if I seek to obey him and follow him, even inside of all my own weakness and stumbling and bumbling, then everything I face, everything that comes down toward me, everything going on, it's all working together for good for me in my relationship with him. Because that doesn't mean good as in everything's going to bring me riches and rainbows and unicorns and cotton candy. It means good as God equates it. It will produce in me a greater understanding of the providence of God, a greater understanding of the love of God, the grace of God. It will produce in me the fruit that remains for eternity if I let it, if I allow him. If the situation you are going through or the struggles you face or the pressures surrounding you are great, and it all seems to indicate things other than Romans 8:28, then these past 3 chapters of Romans 9, 10, and 11 tell us what we can count on. We're seeing the example of what Israel went through. Because all through this sidelight, Paul uses the nation of Israel as an illustration that God is faithful even when his people are not. Even when they're unfaithful and fickle. You can count on God no matter what you face. God will be faithful to you. How can we be sure? Well, look at what we saw in God's relationship with Israel in the past 3 chapters. In chapter 9, Paul pointed to God's past dealings with Israel and highlighted the sovereignty of God. In chapter 10, he deals with God's present dealings with Israel based upon equity, whether Jew or Gentile. We're all invited to be saved, to be grafted into the family of God. And in chapter 11, we come to God's future dealings with Israel, which shows his integrity to keep his promises. God made certain promises to Israel, which he will fulfill. For even though they have blown it badly, God has promised to see Israel through on the basis of his integrity, on the basis of his faithfulness. And the same is true for all of us too. Philippians 1:6 says, being confident of this very thing, that he who began a good work in you. And if you look up that word you, it doesn't mean Jew. It means you. It means everybody. You're included in that. That being confident of this very thing, that he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. That's his promise. And in that promise we can rest. And I am so grateful. He said he's going to be faithful to complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. It means he's going to be faithful to complete it to the end of all things. He was not going to grow tired and weary of you, even inside of your humanness and your fleshliness and your sin and your ugliness. He's not going to grow tired of working in you. And his promise is that he will be the one faithful to complete the work that he began in you. Which puts the onus on who? Well, puts the onus on him. He's the one that's going to be faithful, even when you're not. If your desire is to be in relationship with him, then he's going to do the work. He's going to continue to work in you and on you, sometimes even when you don't want him to. He will. And he's going to put his finger on the areas of your heart. Sometimes it's going to be really hard. It's going to hurt. But when you see it as him doing the process to continue the work in you, you'll see his faithfulness even when it's hard. That's the promises we get to rely on. And now, after the first of the year, don't forget, this is the last Wednesday night service until January. After the first of the year, when we come back and we start with Romans 12, he's going to tell us all the things that we should respond to in this. The way we should respond. Where he beseeches us, therefore, brethren, in the mercies of God, that we present our bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. He's going to come out of this section talking all about Israel to now go, what should our response be? Everything I've built up to now, from Romans 1:1 to here, Romans 12:1, where he's going to start with this. All of it should build a response in our lives. And that's what he spends the rest of this letter going over, and it's just glorious. I love the last parts of Romans. And that's what we'll begin going over after the first of the year again. You can read it ahead. It's okay. But we're going to study it when we come back. But what a glorious thing. God has given us grace. He shows us mercy. And he's not going to pull that away from you. And giving us the examples that we see in the nation of Israel should spur us to respond to him even more. Lord, thank you. Thank you for your word. Thank you for all that you've done for us, so much more than we ever could imagine or ever deserve. But, oh Lord, how good you are. We praise your name, and we worship you. And Lord, I pray that we would allow you to do the work in us that you wish to do. May you work in our lives, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning, new every morning. Great is your faithfulness, O Lord. Great is your faithfulness. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning, new every morning. Great is your faithfulness, O Lord. Great is your faithfulness.